Montana Territory, late spring of 1876. The wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried the scent of pine and rain, but it could not wash away the blood on her dress. Celia Prescott stepped down from the stagecoach in the dying light, her boots touching the mud-packed road of the tiny town of Three Pines. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the shawl over her shoulders, hiding the bruises as best she could. Her face was pale, her dark hair pinned up but coming loose in strands that clung to her damp cheeks. She held nothing but a satchel pressed to her chest. She had nowhere to turn, no family, no home. Her husband was buried 3 days back in a shallow grave near Fort Keogh, a man who'd once promised her protection but gave her broken ribs and endless silence. And now that he was gone, his so-called friends had tried to claim her like cattle on auction. She had run. "Ma'am," a voice called from beside the livery. Deep, slow, a little rough around the edges, she turned, breath-catching, unsure what she expected. The man who stepped into the light was tall, broad-shouldered, with a battered tan hat in his hand and a rifle strapped to his back. His shirt was worn thin at the elbows, his jeans dusty, but his eyes, pale gray like river stone, held no threat, only worry. "Are you Celia?" he asked. She blinked. "Yes, who are you?" "Name's Zeke Whitlow," he said. "Saw your name on the passenger list. Sheriff mentioned someone be common from Keogh. You looked like you could use a hand." She gripped the strap of her satchel tighter. "I do not need a savior." Zeke did not step closer. He just nodded once and looked down at the mud. "All right. But if you change your mind, I got a clean bunkhouse behind my cabin, just outside town. No strings, just a warm place to sleep." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." He did not smile, but something softened in his face before he tipped his hat and walked back toward the livery. That night, Celia slept on the cot in the bunkhouse, curled beneath a thick quilt that smelled like cedar and tobacco. She listened to the sound of horses shifting in the barn and the soft whistle of wind through the trees. For the first time in months, no door slammed in anger. No fists pounded a wall, no threats whispered in the dark, just the silence of Montana and the man who had said her name like it mattered. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the rising sun. Zeke stood by the fire pit, flipping bacon in a cast iron pan. He looked over, nodded, and handed her a tin cup. "You sleep all right," she nodded. "Better than I expected. I figured you'd want to ride into town later. There's a store, you can get what you need." She hesitated. "I have no money." "I did not ask for any." She stared at him, trying to find the catch. His face gave her nothing but patience. After a moment, she took the cup from his hand. They rode into Three Pines in silence. Zeke's gelding was calm and sure-footed, and he had saddled a smaller mare for her. She had not ridden in years, but her body remembered. Zeke rode just ahead, glancing back now and again, never crowding her. Inside the mercantile, Celia picked out a plain dress, new boots, and a bar of lye soap. When she stepped to the counter, the clerk eyed her bruises and said nothing. Zeke paid without a word. "I will pay you back," she said outside on the boardwalk. "I know," he replied and tied the parcel behind his saddle. Later that afternoon, while she sat on the porch of the bunkhouse sewing a tear in her old dress, a sound startled her. A child's cry, faint but close. She stood, heart jumping. It came again near the creek behind the barn. She ran under a tangle of willow branches. She found them 2 small children, barefoot and covered in dirt, curled up on the grass. A boy and a girl. The boy could not have been more than 4, the girl maybe 3. Both were crying, their faces streaked with tears and mud. She knelt. "Sweetheart, what happened?" The boy looked up, eyes red. "Mama's gone." "Gone where?" He shook his head. "She fell down, would not wake up." Celia's throat tightened. She gathered them gently in her arms and carried them back toward the barn. Zeke met her halfway, rifle over his shoulder. "I heard crying, they were by the creek." She swallowed. "He said their mother is dead." Zeke's jaw worked. "I will ride out." "Check for her?" He returned an hour later, silent, his face grim. "She is gone. Looks like she was trying to get them to town, fell from her horse." Celia cradled the girl who had fallen asleep in her lap. "We cannot leave them." Zeke nodded. "No. We will not." They set up a bed for the children in the bunkhouse that night. The boy's name was Beau. The girl was Bonnie. Both had fever. Celia stayed up through the night, wiping their foreheads, whispering lullabies she had not sung since she was a child herself. Zeke brought water, cut firewood, and sat by the door, his rifle across his knees. By morning, the fever broke. Bo clung to Zeke's leg when he tried to leave. "Please do not go." Zeke crouched and ruffled the boy's hair. "I will not." That evening, after the children were asleep, Celia walked out to the porch. Zeke was there, whittling a piece of pine. "They need someone," she said quietly. "Someone steady," he nodded. "So do you," she looked at him. "You do not know what I have been through." "No," he said, meeting her eyes, "but I can see you are still standing." She stepped closer. "Why are you helping me?" He set the wood down. "Because when I saw you step off that stage, I knew your name before you said it. Celia. You looked like someone who had been carrying too much for too long, and I thought maybe I could carry some of it with you." Her chest ached. She had not cried in days. She did not now, but her eyes burned. "You said my name," she whispered, voice thin. "And no one has said it with kindness in a long time." Zeke reached out, slow, careful, and touched her wrist. "I can say it every day if you let me." She let her hand stay in his. The wind moved through the pines. The bunkhouse behind them was quiet. And for the first time in her life, Celia felt something she had never known before: safe, wanted, beginning to believe she might be loved. By the end of May, the last of the snow had melted in the hills, and the creek behind the barn ran faster, its surface dappled with cottonwood seed and sunlight. Wild lupine pushed up along the fence line, blue and soft against the rough grass. Celia stood near the corral, watching Bo help Zeke brush down the mare. Bonnie sat on a feed sack a few yards off, humming to herself, her fingers twisting clover stems into a crooked chain. "They follow you like ducklings," Celia said, her voice quieter than she'd meant. Zeke looked over his shoulder, one hand still on the curricombe. "They're easy to love, even after all they've seen." Celia nodded, arms folded loosely across her bodice. "They don't shy from you." "I've spent enough time alone," he said. "You learn to move gentle when you want things to stay." She walked to the fence, laid her hand on the top rail. "Did you grow up here?" Zeke set the brush aside and leaned on the saddle post. "North of here, little place near Judith Gap. My folks ran cattle and raised 4 boys. I was the youngest, only one who didn't take to ranching." Her brow lifted. "And yet, here you are." "Found my way back to the land eventually. Spent time in the army before that, nothing heroic. Mostly hauling supplies and digging ditches." He paused, then added, "Saw too much of what men can do when no one's watching." Celia's gaze drifted to Bo's small hands stroking the mare's neck. "Will you keep them?" she asked. "They don't have anyone else," he said. "I won't let him get split up." She looked at him then, fully, her face open in a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived. "That's a good thing you're doing," he met her eyes. "So's staying." She looked down, brushing a loose thread from her sleeve. "I haven't decided." Zeke didn't press. He picked up the bridle and began checking the leather for wear. Later, while the children napped, Celia took the time to boil water and scrub the dress she'd arrived in. The fabric was worn thin in places, seams unraveling at the cuffs, but it was hers. She hung it behind the bunkhouse and stood barefoot in the grass, skirts pinned up as she washed her hands in the basin. The air smelled of damp earth and horses. Zeke came around the corner with a coil of fencing wire slung over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. "You'll need another dress soon," he said. "If you're staying—" She reached for the towel. "I can sew, I've just not had the fabric. I'll see if Mrs. Kendall still has that bolt of calico she was trying to sell off last winter. Could trade her some pine planks she's been needin' for her porch." Celia dried her hands. "You don't need to keep giving me things." "I'm not," he said. "I'm offering what's here. You choose what to take." That evening, after supper, Bonnie brought Celia a smooth river stone, warm from her pocket. "It's for your hands," she whispered, pressing it into her palm. Celia felt her throat tighten. She crouched to eye level. "Thank you, sweetheart." Bonnie nodded solemnly, then returned to her brother, who was setting kindling in the stove with practiced care. Zeke sat outside on the porch rail, sharpening a drawknife. The sky behind him had begun to take on the bruised colors of dusk. Celia stepped out and closed the door behind her. I used to think I was meant to be invisible, she said, folding her arms. That if I stayed quiet and small, I'd be safe, but quiet didn't stop the harm. Zeke didn't look up from the blade. You're not invisible here. She stepped off the stoop, the grass cool under her feet. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who wanted something in return, someone waiting to be owed. He turned the blade in his hand, testing its edge. I never could stomach debt. But I believe in giving what you can while you've still got hands to give. The silence between them felt full, not empty. Crickets had begun to sing in the tall grass. I don't know what I'm doing, she said quietly. You're standing, he said. That's enough for now. Celia moved to sit beside him on the rail. Their arms didn't touch, but she could feel his steadiness like heat from a stove. She looked out over the pasture. Do you ever think about starting over? He watched the horizon. Every morning when the sun breaks. That's the only time it feels possible. She nodded. Then, without warning, she turned her hand and let her fingers brush against his. Zeke didn't move, but after a moment, he turned his palm upward and wrapped his fingers gently around hers. No words passed between them. The moment didn't need them. Inside the bunkhouse, the children slept. The night deepened. And for the first time in years, Celia didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she might be stepping toward it. Bonnie clutched the hem of Celia's apron while they stood under the eaves of the barn, watching the first drops of mid-June rain dapple the packed earth. A low thunder rolled somewhere west, beyond the ridgeline. Celia shifted the girl onto her hip and turned toward the open barn doors. Zeke was inside, kneeling beside a split wagon axle propped across two sawhorses. His hands moved steady over the wood, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbows, exposing the long, pale scar that curved around the inside of his left forearm. Celia hadn't asked how it came to be. Not yet. Storm's rolling in, she said, stepping inside. Zeke straightened, brushing sawdust from his trousers. I heard it. Bonnie clung tighter to Celia's neck. Zeke gave a small nod toward the loft ladder. There's a blanket up top. She can rest there while I finish this. Celia climbed carefully, settled the child in the hay with the blanket folded beneath her, then descended. Zeke had returned to his work, the rasp singing against the grain. Celia leaned against a post, hands at her sides. I was thinking, she said, watching the movement of his hands, about teaching Beau his letters. Zeke looked up. You've taught before? No, but my mother did. We had a little schoolroom above the dry goods store where I grew up. I helped her after I turned 12. She had me copy out passages from scripture and old readers until I knew them by heart. She glanced toward the open doors. Beau's smart. He watches everything. Zeke nodded once. He listens too, picks up what's between the words. A gust of wind sent the barn doors creaking. Celia stepped forward, brushing a strand of hay from the workbench. I've been thinking about ways to earn I could take in mending. Maybe write letters for folks who can't. That's a service someone once gave me, and I never forgot the kindness. Zeke set down the rasp. You don't need to prove your way in. It's not about proving, she said, voice steady. It's about building something that's mine. He watched her a long moment, then nodded. There's a desk in the lean-to behind the house. Belonged to my uncle. Needs oil and a new leg brace, but you're welcome to use it. Thank you. Thunder cracked again, closer now, and the smell of rain grew stronger. Bonnie stirred above, murmuring in her sleep. Zeke stepped past Celia to shut the barn doors, easing them into place. As he turned back, she touched his sleeve. You carry yourself like someone with ghosts. His eyes met hers, and something flickered there, not fear, but the memory of it. I do, he said. Most days they keep quiet, some days they don't. She didn't ask more. Just stood there beside him while the rain began to tap against the roof. Later that evening, the four of them ate by lantern light. Celia had made stew with the last of the potatoes and a tin of salt pork. Bonnie sat on Zeke's knee, chewing slowly, her head leaning against his chest. Beau read aloud from a worn primer they'd found in a trunk beside the bunkhouse stove. His voice was careful but sure. After the children slept, Celia stepped outside to find Zeke at the fence line. He held a lantern low, checking the ties on the gate. She walked up beside him, arms folded against the chill. The way you are with them, she said, it's not something you had to learn. He didn't look away from the fence. Had a niece once, my brother's girl. She was 5 when he and his wife took sick. I tried to keep her, but they sent her east to her mother's people. I never saw her again. Celia felt the weight of his words settle into the quiet. You would have been good for her, she said. I think about her when Beau looks at me like I'm supposed to have answers. You do, mostly. He turned then, the lantern light catching the lines near his eyes. You make it easier. Celia reached for his hand not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty, and this time he laced his fingers through hers without pause. I'm not running anymore, she said. Zeke exhaled, slow and deep, like something long held had finally been released. Then stay, he said. Not just until the next thing, stay for good. She looked up at him, eyes steady. If I stay, it's not as a guest. No, he said, it's as what you are. Part of all this. He raised her hand and pressed it against his chest, right over where his heart beat beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. And there in the dark, under the hush of wind and damp wood, she leaned into him firmly, fully like someone who had found not only shelter but home. The rain passed by morning, leaving the air rinsed clean and the mountains ringed in mist. Celia stood by the cabin's hearth, rolling dough into biscuits while the children stacked kindling near the stove. Zeke had ridden out early to check the far fence line, leaving behind 2 saddle-worn gloves and a note scratched onto a scrap of paper left beside a jar of jam. She didn't need to read it to understand the meaning. He always returned. Bonnie tugged at her apron. Can we bring lunch to Zeke? Celia glanced out the window. The sky was clearing, the wind light. She looked back at the girl. If we pack it well, I don't see why not. By midday, she had them bundled into coats, even with the sun warming the pasture. Beau carried the satchel of food, cold biscuits, a strip of dried venison, and a half-pint of pickled beans, and Celia led them along the trail Zeke had taken, following the 2-day-old ruts of his horse's hooves. The high grass whispered around their boots. A pair of hawks circled overhead. They walked in an easy silence until the fence line came into view, running like a stitched seam across the western slope. Zeke was there, kneeling beside a broken post, his back to them. Bonnie broke into a run, calling his name. He turned, rising to his feet with a slow smile. When Celia reached him, he took the satchel from Beau and slung it over one shoulder. You didn't have to come all this way. I know, she said, brushing grass from her skirt, but we hadn't seen you since sunrise. Bonnie insisted. He crouched to Bonnie's height. Well, I'm glad you did. I was needing a reason to stop for a bit. They sat under a pine at the edge of the slope, the children sharing biscuits while Zeke leaned back against the trunk. Celia sat beside him, her knees drawn up, skirt tucked beneath her. He passed her the last strip of dried meat. I've been offered land, he said after a while. She looked over. What kind of offer? Old neighbor from Judith Gap. He's getting too stiff to keep up with his grazing rights, wants to pass them on to someone he trusts. It'd mean adding another 20 head and moving the line north come fall. That's no small thing. No, it's not. He picked up a twig, turned it in his fingers. I haven't decided. She watched as Beau tied and retied the same strip of rawhide around his boot. What's holding you back? He glanced over. I've never done this with someone else in mind. Celia's breath caught, but she kept her voice level. You mean the children? I mean all of you. This isn't just mine anymore. She looked down at her lap. If you took it, what would change? I'd need help, more than I can offer alone, more hands, more planning, but it'd be a future worth building. She didn't speak right away, just reached for the satchel and began folding the cloth that had wrapped their meal. Finally, she said, I could help. I've never managed land, but I can keep records, run planning, handle trade. His voice was softer now. Would you stay? With that in mind, she looked up. Yes, he nodded, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've never asked a woman to tie her life to mine. But I want to ask you. Celia's heart beat hard beneath her ribs. You're not asking out of duty. I don't move from duty, Celia. I've seen what that leads to. I want to build something with you because you're the first thing in a long time that's made me believe it's possible, not just the work. The life, she looked at him fully then, eyes searching his face. I never thought I'd be trusted again or wanted. You are, fully. She reached for his hand and he took it without hesitation. Their fingers threaded together like they'd always known how. "I'll stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go, but because here I finally want to be." The wind stirred the branches above them. Bo lay back in the grass, eyes closed to the sun. Bonnie had curled up with her head on his shoulder. Zeke turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, the touch light but sure. "Then let's build it, together." Celia leaned into him, her cheek against his shoulder, and closed her eyes. She had known fear and silence and the sharp corners of a life built on someone else's anger. But here, against the strength of this man who had said her name like it mattered, she found something better, not rescue, not escape, love that stayed. Love that would not break. By late July, the land had shifted. The grass turned to gold. The creek ran slower. The rhythm of days settled like the steady ticking of a clock. Well-wound early chores, shared meals, hands busy with work that mattered. Celia moved through the cabin as though she'd always belonged there, her handwriting now filling the pages of an account ledger Zeke had unearthed from a dust-covered trunk. She tracked feed costs, calf births, and barter agreements in careful script, her line of numbers steadier than any fence post he'd pounded into the earth. Zeke had stopped riding out alone. When the north pasture needed mending, he brought Bo along to hold the nails, and Celia walked the fence line beside them, her skirts tied up, a hammer tucked into her belt. Bonnie dug for worms in the soft soil nearby, her hat slipping down over her eyes. One evening, while the children dozed in the crook of an old sycamore, Zeke led Celia to the edge of the hilltop above the far field. A pair of horses grazed below, their shadows long in the amber light. "I've been thinking about the cabin," he said, resting a hand on his hip. "It was never built for more than one man. The roof'll hold a few more winters, but the walls are thinning. I want to add on." She studied the slope of the land, the way it opened westward. "Where, out that way, 2 rooms, maybe 3, a proper hearth. And a porch that runs the length of it." She turned to him, her eyes catching the last of the light. "That sounds like a home. I want to build it with you, from the first nail to the last hinge. I don't want anything in this life that you haven't helped shape." Celia looked down at the soil beneath her boots, then up at his face. "Do you know what it means to be asked that?" Zeke stepped forward and took her hand. "I know what it means to mean it." She nodded once, then let herself lean into him, her forehead resting against his chest. His arms came around her, sure and warm. They married the following week under the cottonwood tree behind the barn. No preacher came, no papers signed. But the neighbor who'd offered Zeke the grazing rights came down from Judith Gap with his wife and a quilt stitched in the pattern of flying geese. The Kendalls brought a jug of sorghum and a plate of dried apple hand pies. Bo stood tall in a shirt Zeke had sewn smaller by hand, and Bonnie scattered wildflowers along the grass. Celia wore a dress she'd sewn from the calico bolt Mrs. Kendall had traded for. She had cut it long, with room to kneel, and stitched a row of tiny buttons down the back. Her hands did not tremble when she placed them in Zeke's. Her voice did not waver when she said his name. That night, after the lanterns were doused and the neighbors rode home, Zeke carried her across the threshold of the cabin. The bunkhouse had already been turned into a room for the children. The main room was quiet, soft with firelight. Their shared bed sat beneath the window, cedar branches tucked along the sill to keep the flies away. Zeke brushed the pins from her hair one by one. Celia unfastened the buttons at the back of her dress, feeling his hands steadying her waist. He traced the line of her spine as though he meant to memorize it, and when they came together, it was not with urgency, but with reverence. As though each of them had been waiting to be seen, and this was the first time the light had reached them. In the weeks that followed, the new addition rose one board at a time. Zeke sawed and nailed while Celia sanded and sealed each beam. Bo learned to measure twice before cutting. Bonnie brought them water, her hands full of wild mint. By autumn, the cabin had doubled in size. The new porch looked west, just as Zeke had wanted, and they ate supper on it most nights, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The children's laughter echoed across the field, and in quiet moments, Celia would reach for Zeke's hand, anchoring herself not in fear, but in the quiet assurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. That winter, they hosted the first neighbor gathering inside the expanded cabin. Snow lay thick outside, but the hearth burned bright. Celia passed coffee and bread. Zeke carved slices of smoked venison. Bonnie curled up beneath the quilt gifted at the wedding, and Beau read aloud from the newest reader Celia had ordered by post. When the last neighbors had gone, Zeke stood at the door watching the snow fall. "You ever think about the first day we met?" he asked. Celia came to stand beside him, her hand slipping beneath his arm. "Every day, I remember the mud and the ache in my bones. But mostly I remember you saying my name like it mattered." He looked down at her, his eyes soft. "It did, it always will." She leaned up and kissed him, slow and certain. The lamps burned low. The cabin stood strong. And outside, the wind moved gently through the bare trees, carrying no threat, only the promise of another morning to rise, to love, and to build. Together, always.